Chapter 2, Ethics of Assessment.
So in this chapter, we are exploring how the Code of Ethics connects with assessment for counselors. So we will look at the ACA Code of Ethics, the ASCA Code of Ethics for school counselors, and some other standards in counseling and assessment that are from some different organizations. So first, talking about the American Counseling Association Code of Ethics, which hopefully is decently fresh in your memory from our ethics class. We have to adhere to an entire standard from Section E about assessment and counseling. And so one of the biggest and most important is the purpose of assessment. And so making sure that we are using assessments as they're meant to be used and making sure that we are including them appropriately in our counseling work and we are clear about what the purpose is for the client. So there's that informed consent process that we keep coming back to. And part of that is not just the informed consent process at the beginning of giving some kind of assessment, but also the importance of the openness about what the results mean. And so it's important, again, to foster that ethical principle of autonomy, that we are clear with the clients about interpreting the outcomes, making sure that they understand the results of any kind of testing that we use, and that we are really open about what that testing means and let the client help us make meaning of that. So it wouldn't be appropriate to use any kind of testing to try to manipulate a client, take advantage of a situation. Certainly not ethical for us to just use a battery of tests to try to find something wrong so we could bill insurance or something like that, but making sure that we're using all assessments with a purpose and making sure that we're really open and the client feels like they have the option to agree to that testing as much as possible, depending on the setting. So we don't ever want to use testing to exert our sense of power and control over a client, and certainly would never want to withhold the results from a client they absolutely have access to and the right to have and understand those results from any kind of testing. So in that, it's important for us to make sure that we have competency in the assessments that we're using. And so we're not using any kind of testing, any kind of assessment, interview, observation tools that we are not trained in or that are not covered by our scope of practice or our degree. So we'll talk here just shortly about the different levels of testing and what kinds of things as master's level clinicians that you will be able to do with the training that you get as part of your master's program. So in that, we have to make sure that we're using the assessments in the way that they were meant to be used, in the way that they were developed. So we can't use them outside of what's recommended in the testing manual or in the testing instructions, and make sure that in sharing the results, we are clear about the limitations of what those results might mean. So we're not making any kind of overreaching assumptions or statements or conclusions using testing or assessment that are not appropriate. In sharing results, we want to, of course, make sure the client has access to and knows and understands those results. But we also have to make sure that we're adhering to the confidentiality of the client. So we are not sharing those results with anyone without any kind of permission. The one caveat or exception to that might be in suicide assessment. So in that case, it might represent a potential exception to confidentiality in which a client might be at risk of harm to themselves or others. And so as a result of the outcome of that assessment, we would have to share that information with someone without the client's consent, and that's covered under those exceptions to confidentiality that we would go over in informed consent. So beyond that, we have to make sure that we're only sharing those results with the permission of the client and adhering to those rules of confidentiality, and that the client understands that. So then also we have to understand cultural implications and the influence of culture on assessment. So we'll talk about norming and we'll talk about cultural groups and the way that assessments are developed. And so we might have to help contextualize or maybe even consider that assessments may not be entirely accurate given certain cultural context for a client and the assessment that we're using. And then the psychometrics. So we have to make sure that we know how to understand how reliable and how valid these assessments are, which is something that we will talk about in the next module of this course. And we're able to explain those to the client so that the client understands that the measures that we are using, the testing that we are using, is something that's appropriate, that meets the context and the purpose of our work with that client, and that they are both reliable and valid measures of the type of information that we're trying to gather. In a school counseling context, the ASCA Code of Ethics also addresses assessment and testing. And so in section 813 of the ASCA Code of Ethics, they talk about ways to appropriately and ethically use assessment and testing in school settings. And so I've linked in the course page for you all of the entirety of the ASCA Code of Ethics so that you can look at that section on testing and read through the actual wording of the code, because it is not listed in your textbook. So I've given you some additional resources to take a look at some of these, particularly if you're thinking about working in a school counseling context. So some of these things overlap quite a bit with the ACA Code of Ethics. For example, making sure that the testing that you are using is valid and reliable as much as possible, that the testing that you're using is within the scope of practice of a school counselor and within the competency. So again, that your degree or training allows you to be able to give that kind of testing, adhering to the confidentiality of making sure that those test results are not shared outside of the school setting without the consent of the parent. And then developmental considerations. So in addition to the cultural considerations we've talked about, we also have to think about, in working with children and adolescents, we have to make sure that the assessments are developmentally appropriate for them. So if a child is developmentally too young or too old for a certain type of testing or assessment, it may not be accurate for that child or give us a good picture of what's going on. So we have to consider that developmental piece as well. So in school counseling, and you'll learn about this more in the school counseling courses that you'll take, it's important for school counselors to develop recommendations on multiple points of data. So not just on testing, not just on one type of assessment, but again, we're going to use that collateral, we're going to use those professional resources, talk to teachers, talk to parents, look at educational records, perhaps consult with people outside of the school if necessary, and use all of those different data points to put together recommendations for what a child might need to be successful in the school environment. And then those same sorts of guidelines around interpretation and application. So making sure that the assessments that you're using are appropriate given the norming data for the school setting that you're in, making sure that that interpretation is done accurately, and making sure that those outcomes are used accurately and not misused within a school setting. So this might require some advocacy work on the part of the school counselor to help make sure that the teachers, that the administrators, that the other support professionals in the school all really understand what these different testing outcomes mean and how to best use them to support the child's development in the school. Now, one piece of this testing puzzle that we won't necessarily dig into too much in this course, but I do want to acknowledge, is ASCA does have a position statement that says that the role of the school counselor is not a role of just someone who administers tests. So, for example, someone who proctors standardized testing for schools, like those annual tests that students would have to take, like here it's a YTOP test. ASCA does say that it is not necessarily appropriate for the school counselor's role to be someone who is just around to administer and interpret testing. But it is one piece of the role of the school counselor. And so we won't dig into the school counselor's role in terms of being test administrators in this course, because you'll get into that more in your school counseling course where you talk about the ASCA national model. But in terms of the school counselor and the role of assessments that's within that appropriate context, these are the different ethical considerations that you will need to pay attention to. So if during this class you just start to feel really enthusiastic about the idea of assessments, there is a division of ACA that is dedicated to focus on both research and assessment and counseling. They're called AARC, so the Association for Assessment and Research in Counseling. Actually just had their national conference, which had to be converted to a virtual conference this time. So they just held that last month, I believe. And they're quite a big division of ACA. They've got a really steady membership, and they have a lot of grants and scholarships and different opportunities for students to get involved. And so as you're going through this class, if you just find yourself getting very excited about assessments or very excited about the idea of doing research, which does not necessarily connect as much to this class, perhaps AARC would be a good home for you professionally. And they were previously known as the Association for Assessment in Counseling and Education, but they have fairly recently added this piece about research, and not to get off on too much of a tangent here, but they really push this idea that counselors can be researchers. So, we might think about research as being something that's really boring or really difficult, and maybe something that just belongs in university settings or in lab settings. But what AARC promotes is that research is really, it can be a part of the counseling picture too, because you're doing all this wonderful work with your clients. And so research just gives you different tools to be able to capture what's going on so you can share it with other people. And so when they changed their name, they added in that research component to help promote and empower counselors to be both researchers and to appropriately use assessment in counseling. And so they have a lot of different resources. If you go to their website, and I can link it on our course page for you, they've got lots and lots of resources for you about assessment and about research. But they have the REST system, and I've included a copy of the REST document in our module for this chapter. And in this document, they talk about fair and appropriate administration of testing and assessment. And so in that, they address test users, so what qualifies people to give assessments, interpret assessments, how to do that appropriately, making sure that those who are using testing has the appropriate knowledge and training to choose the correct test, to understand the psychometrics of that testing, to administer, score, and then interpret those results and communicate them effectively to a client in a way that's accessible and ethical. So the same sorts of things that we've been talking about, they just give more concrete guidelines about how this ideally should be done. So that REST system, again, is available on our module page for this section of the course for you to be able to look into a bit further. They also have standards for multicultural assessments, which is not something that your book discusses, but I have also linked on our module page for this section of the course. So these were just recently updated, and they have different guidelines and considerations for counselors to make sure that they're exercising cultural competency and assessment, which is something that we will talk about in the next chapter. So for counselors, how do we know that we're competent to be able to use assessment and testing? So a lot of that you learn in this course, and those are tied to certain CACREP outcomes that are connected to this idea of testing and assessment. So if you look at our syllabus for the course and all of our courses, you'll see that there are different CACREP learning outcomes that are tied to every single class that we have as part of our program. And these learning outcomes are different skills or competencies that CACREP has determined counselors need in order to be able to be competent practitioners. And so those often now align with state licensing competencies. And so that's why we harp over and over again on the importance of coming from an accredited program, because in many states now, having that accredited degree tells the licensing board that you are competent to do all of these things. And so in the way of assessment for programs, we use those learning outcomes as part of the way that we build our courses so that we can make sure that we're measuring how you as students are developing and learning these competencies so that we can make sure that you have all the skills that you need to be able to do all aspects of your counseling work in schools or communities. And so these competencies are, a lot of them, connected to this course, to our textbook and to those CACREP outcomes that are associated with this class that are listed in your syllabus. So it's important to understand as counselors that we need to know basic measurements, we need to understand reliability, validity, norming information, which we'll cover in this course, basics of statistics, so that we can use them to the degree necessary to score and understand and interpret different kinds of testing, which again we'll talk about in this course. And then there's some different kinds of formulas, standard of error, ways to look at a testing manual. So we'll look at some examples of testing manuals and testing reports as part of this course. And then making sure that for each assessment, we are able to use those testing manuals to understand the procedures for how to appropriately administer, score, and interpret a test. So if we aren't following the procedures, then the testing outcomes may not be accurate. So we have to make sure that no matter what kind of testing we're using, we are adhering to the procedures that are appropriate for the way that we would administer, score, and interpret that test to make sure that it is accurate. So these competencies continue, so making sure that as counselors, you understand what kind of tools that you have in your toolbox. So understanding what kinds of major tests and assessments that we might use in our fields in your setting, and knowing which ones of those you are able to give and administer with the training and the degree that you'll have at the completion of your program. And it's important to make sure that you're able to identify where to access testing and to make sure that you know where that information is coming from in terms of the test. So, for example, making sure that you're getting norming and validity information from a testing manual and not just from a website, unless that website is from the people who create and distribute the test. So we have to make sure that where we're getting information about testing is accurate. There's a lot of other different kinds of technical competencies, a lot of which we'll cover in this course. Making sure that we're able to compare and contrast different kinds of testing so that we can understand how to best choose the type of testing and assessment that we need to capture a picture of what it is the client needs. And then being able to explain the strengths and weaknesses of that testing to the client in a way that's accessible and understandable for them. Again, norming, we'll talk a lot about norming. And this last one's pretty important. So helping the clients to understand that taking any kind of test or assessment is a tool for exploration. It's not meant to be a labeling experience. So it can be easy for a client, depending on the outcome of an assessment, to feel like they're branded or labeled or like it says something about them or changes who they are as a person. And really, it's just a tool for exploration to learn more about what's going on and then to consider it in the context of those multiple points of information. So more competencies, making sure that we are able to guide an interpretive session and to pace accordingly. And by pace, that means that we need to stop and make sure that the client is understanding what we are talking about. We can't just spit out all the results and say, thank you, have a nice day, because that would be really confusing and misleading. So we have to make sure that the client is able to understand the outcomes of a test or an assessment in their own way. And so we can't go too quickly or they might get lost or feel overwhelmed or feel like they're not empowered in the process. Also important to make sure that clients are able to apply what they learn from those assessments into their decision-making process and to think about any kind of decisions related to like developmental tasks or life choices and use that information in a way that's helpful and powerful as opposed to feeling like it's used in a way that's limiting. So thinking about things like IEPs and any kind of testing that's needed to diagnose a student to be able to access IEPs, that can really quickly become a limiting process, or we can use that testing and assessment in a way that's empowering to help include the student and their parents in a decision-making dialogue to make sure that we're using that in a way that helps empower a student's developmental process instead of feeling like it's limiting. Again, making sure that testing, the outcomes are accurate, that we explain them accurately, that we're taking time to really explain it in layman's terms and make sure that we're not just using a bunch of jargon that a client may not understand. And so the same counseling skills that we are learning are the same skills that we're going to need to use when we are talking about results of testing and assessment with a client. In continuing to use those skills, we might need to stop and process how clients are reacting to the outcomes of a test, paying attention to verbal or nonverbal cues. So, for example, if a client starts to cry while we're talking about the outcomes of assessment, we probably need to stop and check in about that situation. And so a lot of these are just relating to using those basic counseling skills in the way that we are talking about assessment and testing. Making sure that we're interpreting forms and reports appropriately so that the clients can really understand what everything means, making sure they're able to actually look at the reports. So they should be able to take a look at them, hold them in their hands, and not feel like it's just something that I have access to, because that isn't very empowering for them. Making sure that we're familiar with any kind of legal precedent. We'll talk about some laws here in a moment. Any kind of professional or ethical standards related to testing, which we are talking about in this chapter. And then making sure that we know about all of our responsibilities in testing and assessment around things like confidentiality, client rights, HIPAA, FERPA, and these kinds of things that we're going to be talking about more in this chapter. Finally, in terms of competencies, we have to make sure that we understand current issues and trends in testing, making sure that we are using the most recent versions of any kind of tests or assessments that we are going to put into place with our clients, making sure that we are helping a client to be able to address any kind of test-taking anxiety, or making sure that they have the appropriate amount of skill to be able to complete a test. This includes looking at things like accommodations that might need to be in place to make sure that a student is able to take a test in a way that's accessible for them. And then looking at different kinds of technology needs around computer-assisted and computer-adaptive testing. So do they need access to a computer? How are they going to get access to the computer? Do they have the skills necessary to use the computer? And then test user qualifications, which are the different levels of testing and knowing which kinds of tests and assessments you are qualified to give to your clients. So for test user qualifications, there are different levels of tests that exist, and you can find pretty easy in test manuals what level this is, because this ABC scale is pretty universal in terms of testing and assessment. So level A is no advanced training required. These might be like self-assessments that a client could take on their own. So there are different kinds of tests and assessments, surveys, different things that you can give a client and they can take at home and perhaps bring back to you, or they can just take on their own and make their own sense and meaning out of. There are lots of career assessments in this area. There's some different personality testing in this area. So different things that are now a lot of times computerized that a client could just log on and take, and then it will interpret for them. This level B testing requires a graduate degree with coursework and assessment. So at the completion of this program, you will be qualified to give any kind of level B testing and assessment that you are trained and competent to work with. And throughout the course of your career, you might have the opportunity to train on different kinds of assessment in different kinds of work settings. So that scope of competency might change a lot as you go through your career and get exposed to new and different kinds of testing and assessment. And then there's the C level, which is everything at level B plus having a doctoral degree in psychology or counseling or social work or some other related fields. And then usually have to have licensure certification. In some cases, an LPC would qualify here, depending on what your training looks like. A lot of times it's psychology license. and then direct supervision of qualified professional, which is in your provisional licensure stage. And then a lot of time these C-level assessments are pretty complex. And so to really be able to accurately administer them, if they're not computerized, you really do have to go and get additional certifications and training. So things like Wechsler intelligence tests, thematic apperception tests, there are some different things that just have kind of more specific administration guidelines. And so it just requires some additional training and some additional practice to be able to use it accurately with clients. So some of those C-level testing you wouldn't typically use in a counseling setting. It would more be used in maybe in a school with a school psychologist, and that's their primary responsibility is to just do different kinds of testing, or in different kinds of settings that specialize in testing. So that's where you might have individuals that are more specifically trained for those C-level assessments. So to close out chapter 2, we'll just talk a little bit about different court cases and laws that impact assessment and testing. And one of the bigger ones is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the ADA. So we hear ADA quite a lot around issues of accessibility, and it had a lot to do with testing and assessment. So I think we see this the most in education settings, but it can be just as accurate in like employment settings. So thinking about, for example, when I worked with young adults with intellectual disabilities, they would try to apply for a lot of jobs, and some of those jobs now require you to apply on the computer and take some sort of personality test as part of the application for some of the bigger chain stores. And so we would sometimes have to look at getting accommodations for individuals to be able to take those employment tests because they weren't necessarily accessible, or individuals under the ADA that we worked with might qualify for certain accommodations, and we would work with like vocational rehab, for example, to be able to help put some of those accommodations in place. And so under the ADA, employers cannot select and administer employment tests if a certain registered disability or recognized diagnosed disability would adversely affect performance on that test. So for example, those kind of personality tests that our individuals we worked with would have to take online, well, they didn't always necessarily understand the questions, or maybe the reading level wasn't there. And so a lot of times they would have, for example, a button that you could click and it would read the screen for you. So we had some adaptive technology that they could use if the reading level was not there, or if they had some issues with blindness or hearing impairment, different kinds of things like that. So there might just be some reasonable accommodations, and the law really harps on this idea of what's reasonable, which is another conversation for another day. But under the ADA, with assessment and testing, individuals have the right to reasonable accommodations. And so particularly in education settings, we see these, but they're just as applicable in employment settings too. But examples of those reasonable accommodations might be extending testing time, so giving someone a longer time to be able to take a test, providing written materials in a large print or braille or audio tape, or using some of those adaptive technology pieces so that they can be read. There's a lot of ADA compliance in terms of websites to make sure that those adaptive technology devices can actually read everything that's on your website. Perhaps providing a reader or sign language interpreter to someone in order to be able to complete testing and assessment. Holding test administration in an accessible location, so making sure everyone can get in the building to even take it in the first place. And then assistive devices, which is some of that adaptive technology that's out there to help individuals be able to have appropriate access to all of the testing, assessment, and other things in society that we would want them to have access to. So some other things in terms of legal issues, and your book goes into a lot more detail with these, so we'll just hit the highlights. But some of the bigger legislative changes in terms of testing and assessment were the Civil Rights Act of 1991, also known as Title VII. So in that, it addresses discrimination in assessment and hiring. And so making sure that assessments are not used in a way that's discriminatory or that would specifically exclude someone from accessing something, which is using the assessment in a way that is not intended. We, of course, have FERPA, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, which addresses privacy in testing and education settings. The IDEA, which is a follow-up to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so this is about using assessment and testing to be able to identify disabilities so that we can help individuals be able to access resources and educational supports that they might need. And in that case, that has to be accessible to them at least until the age of 21. And so a lot of special ed programs, the age 21 is pretty important because of this IDEA legislation that requires that testing and assessment and the access to those supports. And then, of course, HIPAA, which we have talked about before, and that just relates to privacy of health records. And in this case, health records would be the outcomes of any kind of testing and assessment and the reports that would go along with that. Lastly, in this chapter, we are going to talk about some educational legislation that informed assessment of outcomes in education. And some of these are a little controversial and interesting. So the No Child Left Behind Act, which is one that was in place when I was coming up through K-12 school, that was meant to hold schools accountable for making sure that all students learned what they needed to learn and that schools were striving for positive outcomes and making sure that they were essentially teaching everything they were supposed to teach and the children were able to access that information and learn it, which sounds like a really great idea, right? We want every kid to be able to learn. But one of the things that came out of this movement is this question of how do we measure outcomes in education? And so from that came this idea of high stakes testing and the use of standardized testing to be able to measure outcomes for schools. And again, this came from a really well-meaning place of like, okay, well, we'll just use these outcomes to assess how schools are doing. And if schools have high test scores, it means that they're doing a really great job and we should invest and help those schools. And if they're not getting high test scores, then we probably need to pay attention to what's going on there because it means that they're not doing what they should be doing. So this was the theory. However, in practice, what we know is that there's this whole systemic piece, right? So a bad test score does not necessarily equal a bad school. It just might be a school that is not as full of resources, or there might be some other systemic factors that are impacting the school. And so in all of that, there's some back and forth about, does this high stakes testing help or hurt or both? And so we see things like test anxiety coming out of this. We see changes in curriculum standards. We see changes in the way that teachers approach pedagogy, approach the classroom, approach curriculum and lesson planning. And it became more and more about these achievement tests and more about these high stakes tests that we're using to measure outcomes of the school and less about engaging in appropriate and effective learning strategies. And so even in the shift to this Every Student Succeeds Act, which is meant to hold schools accountable and look more at school performance, we don't necessarily see this helping either because then it lumps all the schools into state groups. And so if your state's not doing well, that could impact how many resources your school is getting. And so it's just important to know, and a lot of you might already work in a school setting and are well aware of how much of a role testing and assessment has come to play into schools and decision making in school districts and the experiences of students. But it's just something to be aware of in this whole big picture of testing and assessment. So in our course page for this module, I've listed an article for you if you're interested in just learning a little bit more about how this high stakes testing really impacts curriculum development for K through 12 schools and teachers. I've linked an article for you to read if you'd like to learn a little bit more about that. And then the Perkins Act is the same sort of idea around career and technical education. So meant to look at how do we measure outcomes for education? How do we make sure that schools are held accountable? And so it's the same sort of idea around this different curriculum in schools in career and technical education, as opposed to just the traditional like reading, math, science that are measured in the No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds Act testing strategies. And then finally, there are just some different court rulings that have informed different types of rules related to protocols for testing, types of assessments, how assessments and testing are allowed to be used in different kinds of settings. And so I just encourage you, they're right at the end of chapter 2, just take a look through that list that's included in the textbook and just familiarize yourself a little bit with those kinds of rules and laws. But those are the kinds of things that if one of those is impacting your work setting, you'll probably know about it because it'll be a big part of the training that you get as you integrate into that setting. So just sort of peruse that list, get familiar with it in terms of just exposure. And then certainly as we get into more curriculum specific to schools and community settings, we'll talk more about those relevant laws in other courses in the program.